Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this roundtable discussion on rupturing anti-Blackness in English education. Thank you to Dr. Dita Chico and to the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies for this collaboration and for inviting us to take part in your 2021-2022 series, Anti-Racism, Communities, and Collaborations. Hello again, everybody. My name is Rosina Zamora-Liu, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as an Asian American woman and as a non-Black critical race educator of color. I am a faculty in the urban education specialization here at the university, and as a co-chair along with my colleague, Dr. Tara Brown, of the Teaching and Learning and Policy Leadership Department Anti-Racist Task Force, it is my privilege and honor to serve as moderator for today's special event. As many of you know from this description of today's talk, it's centering on affirming Blackness and rupturing systems of anti-Blackness. This scholarship is not only important, it must be forefronted and prioritized if we are to commit to dismantling systems that dehumanize Black youth in our schools and in our communities. As statues of Confederate racists are pulled down and major streets and schools are renamed, we recognize that in education, teachers and administrators continue to struggle and in some cases avoid and or refuse to identify the everyday harm that their practices and values in their curriculum and policies, in their assignments, syllabi, and public statements. Similarly, in the context of English education and literacy research, examinations of anti-racist practices and racial discourses in classrooms are rapidly showing up in journals, yet few of these studies effectively strike at the onto-epistemologies of white supremacy and anti-Blackness beyond what you see as superficial syntheses of literature reviews and intellectual exercises of theory. Researchers continue to fragmentize students' intersectionalities as well as their own, thus decentering race and gender, thus decentering Blackness and Black living. In acknowledgement of the perpetuation of anti-Blackness, in his book, Ontological Terror, Blackness, Nihilism, and Emancipation, Dr. Calvin Warren asks this question: can Blacks have life? What would such life mean within an anti-Black world? As Black anti-racist educators, our esteemed colleagues today have extended and reframed this question to the context of an anti-Black literacy educational system, and they ask, how can educators center Black youth living and Black youth brilliances? What kinds of teaching and learning processes foster equity, disrupt systemic anti-Blackness, and deepen learning? Framed by critical race, Black critical race, and emancipatory perspectives, our invited speakers and scholars suggest that affirmation of Blackness is key in rupturing anti-Blackness in education. Please join me right now in welcoming these most excellent scholars with us today. In alphabetical order, let me begin with Dr. Justin Coles, who is an assistant professor of social justice education at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is also director of Arts, Culture, and Political Engagement, Center of Racial Justice, Youth Engaged Research. He is also co-editor of the highly regarded journal, Equity and Excellence in Education. Next with us is Dr. Autumn Griffin, who is a McDonald Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. She is guest co-editor of a special issue in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education entitled Racing Towards Futurity, Black and Latinx Youth's Multimodal Composition in Future Selves and Literacies. And she is also a UMD College of Education graduate, of whom we adore and are so deeply proud of. And then, of course, my dear friend, Dr. Stephanie Jones, who is an assistant professor of education at Grinnell College in Iowa. She is part of the inaugural cohort of Associated Colleges of the Midwest Mellon Faculty Fellows. She is a guest co-editor, the lead guest co-editor of a special issue of English Teaching, Practice, and Critique entitled Anti-Blackness in English Curriculum, Practice, and Culture. Next is Dr. Stephanie Tolliver, who is an assistant professor of literacy and secondary humanities at University of Colorado, Boulder. As many of you may also know, she has a new book entitled Recovering Black Storytelling in Qualitative Research in Darkened Storywork with Routledge. We are very excited to hear about that work today. And finally, please welcome my dear friend, our esteemed colleague, Dr. Jennifer Turner, who is Associate Professor in Reading Education here at Maryland. She is the lead guest co-editor of the special issue of the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, entitled Racing Towards Futurity, Black and Latinx Youth Multimodal Composition of Future Selves and Literacies. Welcome, everybody. We are so honored to learn from each of you this afternoon. As a general format, I will do my best to address some questions to each of you individually, but even so, if you feel like you'd like to contribute to it, please do so, because I'm hoping that this can be as conversational as possible and for me to speak as little as possible. So to begin our conversation, I think it's important for everybody to understand the context of how we're currently understanding anti-Blackness and Black supremacy in white supremacy in our curriculum, and how they continue to show up in our schools across the country, and by way of curriculum violence and racial trauma. So just setting up the context and the problem that we see it right now. As you also know, that as we continue to witness ways that pre-service and practicing teachers may struggle to implement anti-racist practices in their own teaching. So Dr. Jones and Dr. Tolliver, I know that you both have powerful scholarships around this area. In your research and teaching, what are ways, if you may share with us, that you've seen curriculum violence and racial trauma perpetuating in our schools and in dominant teaching practices and values, particularly with pre-service teachers and practicing teachers? If I could start with Dr. Jones.
Hi, thanks everybody for being here. Special thanks to Dr. Lou for setting all of this magic up. We're about to have the best panel. I hope you all are ready. So when we think about curriculum violence and racialized trauma, which is what my work is about, we need to situate anti-Blackness first. And I think the scholars on this panel have written extensively about that. But it's a question that, if you know the old proverb, there's nothing new under the sun, we've been asking this question for a long time. Like, so when Du Bois talks about what it feels like to be a problem, he's talking about anti-Blackness. When James Baldwin is talking about or writing in a talk for teachers about how Black children know that when they go to school, they're told this narrative that they can be anything, including the president of the United States. But then in that same breath, the teacher tells them that they haven't contributed anything to society. That's anti-Blackness, right? This idea that you are always disposable, that you are always othered, and that you are always the center of the problem. And so when Stephanie and I talk about this work, it's important that you recognize that both of us are storytellers and we're keepers of stories. My issue is that I'm focusing on the stories that have happened in the past or that are happening right now, in terms of how children, especially Black and brown children, are being harmed in the classroom. And I think just this week alone, we have plenty of examples of teachers out here being reckless. I think the current one that happened, was it yesterday, was a woman a math teacher attempting to teach SOHCAHTOA, but decided that instead of just doing sine, cosine, and tangent like everybody else, we got to dress up, right? And so when we think about centering Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous education, and that everywhere we step out here in this world is Indigenous land, everything that we see is Indigenous land, how does something like that continue to happen in schools? So I've started a project called Mapping Racialized Trauma in Schools that you can find on Facebook, where I just chart these incidents of racialized trauma and in particular curriculum violence. And what I'm noticing is that because of our intense indoctrination and in our intense obsession with making sure that Black and Brown children stay in their particular place, that we have organized our education to continue that pattern. So we're wondering why we are still continuing to be harmed in this way, and it has not ended. And so I recognize my place of staying in this particular time and also looking backwards to understand where we are going, and then how that connects to Professor Tolliver's work around how can the future help us lift ourselves out of this realm of anti-Blackness. So I think with our conversation, we're going to dip in and out, all of us, in terms of how we're contributing to each other's work, because it's all layered and it's all there together. Stephanie Tolliver, what do you have?
I always got lots to say. But when I'm thinking about, like, I really appreciate your framing of anti-Blackness, because I feel like what happens in a lot of these conversations is that, like, anti-Blackness is this word that we consistently use and never define. It's just this thing that exists, everyone knows it, and then we just leave it at that. So I appreciate the framing, because I think that's important. It's an important part of the conversation that sometimes is missing, even though it shouldn't be. And then, of course, like you said, my work is dealing in futurity. And so one of the things that there was a quote that I remember from some scholarship on anti-Blackness, and they talk about the fact that, I want to say Mills is the last name, I can't remember the first name right now, but they say that, like, this anti-Blackness is strategic and it's the bedrock of Western civilization, and that, like, the very centrality of it to this world means that, like, any racial equality would have tectonic repercussions. And if we're thinking about, like, let me go in back in geography from, like, high school, like, to have that, like, millions of years ago, we had, like, Pangea, right? And then these tectonic shifts caused us to cause the continents to separate and caused everything to shift and change to where we no longer view the world in the way it once was. And so in order for us to rupture anti-Blackness, we would have to have those shifts to create new worlds that do not currently exist. And I feel like because of that, we have created structures that keep the norm, keep this continent in the way that it is, because that's what is valuable. And in order to create this valuable stuff, somebody has to be othered, someone has to be devalued, and usually it's Black and Brown children. And so how I see this in the context of not just, like, where we are and where we could possibly go, but, like, when I'm looking into teacher education and thinking about futurity, one of the things that I'm seeing is that there's a failure to imagine that Black and Brown people exist in that future. So when I'm working with students and we talk about, like, racial justice or diversity or whatever term that we're using in the moment, there's this idea that all of our future students are white, that there is no Black and Brown students for us to teach. So when I give certain examples and I say, okay, so we're going to bring these texts into schools, and some of the students will be like, well, what if they don't connect with it? And I'm like, wait a minute, which students are you talking about? Because when you say they, you're assuming that it's a general, like, all of my students in my future classroom, but this little Black girl in this story, there's going to be little Black girls in your class. And even if they're not, the white students need to learn about little Black girls too. And so I think that that's one of the issues that I'm seeing in terms of teacher education. Of course, there's always, like, the familiar, I want steps to anti-racism, like, give me the list of 1 through 10 things that I can check off in order to be an anti-racist professional. And so that's one of the other things where it's like, we can't, not we, but I feel like in terms of when I'm looking at pre-service teachers, there's this lack of self-reflection and lack of an acknowledgement that this has to be a critical something work that's going to last over time and not something that you can just be like, oh, look, anti-racism, check, cultural relevance, check, look at me with this lesson plan, check, check, check. Like that's not the way that it works. And so that's another thing that I see. And then I think the last thing is, and this I think refers sometimes to the canon, sometimes to other literacy elements, is that like we can't see beyond whiteness. Like there's a block, like I'm thinking of like glass ceiling, and you can't see beyond what's there because whiteness is consistently blocking the possibilities of futures for Black and brown students. When you have like, oh, well, I get why bringing in Toni Morrison might be valuable to some students, but like, will they really be prepared for their future if they don't read Shakespeare? Like, we can't see beyond it. We just have this idea that like, oh, if we ain't reading white stuff, then we're not really doing the critical work of education. And that's not only like in pre-service teachers and schools and all that, but it's also in like, what are we teaching in our education theory scholarship? Like, are we bringing in Black scholars outside of just like, oh, this is the black horse? Are we having just one? Because usually it's the one where they get all of the everything, and that's supposed to be enough. Okay, I'm gonna stop because I know everybody else got stuff to say, but like I know like I'll get on my little soapbox, but I do feel like there's a lot that blocks our possibilities for futures. And I think this is why I do the work that I do, because anti-Blackness is so ingrained into the soil of this land that we won't get to the future if we don't disrupt it.
Can I add one more thing to that? Because I have to wrap this up in this idea of what happens when we rely on this checklist in order to absolve us of our complicity in this work. I think what that Mapping Racial Trauma site shows you is that this is what happens when you attempt to do good work. Teachers think they out here really doing something, and then you're harming people in the process. So we have to talk about how it's so ingrained in you that even your intentions of doing it well still harm people. And that's what people have to situate themselves with. Go off.
That's brilliant. Thank you to Dr. Jones, Dr. Tolliver. What I really appreciate this conversation is that checklist items, that's the harm, right? Because we're asking for quick fixes to structural, deeply embedded issues. Sit with it and figure it out and your own complicities to it. So I appreciate that so much. And yet, so many scholars, so many of you here are doing things that are working as well to elevate Black youth. And I know that as we're thinking about the sustaining power of systems and anti-Blackness and white supremacy, many of you are doing phenomenal work. And I'm thinking right now of, I know Dr. Tolliver, at some point, I would love to hear your book that you have on how we can think about this. And Dr. Griffin, Dr. Coles, and Dr. Turner, you are currently working with Black youth and thinking about liberation, liberatory spaces. And if I may ask you to then talk a little bit about your individual work with us and how this learning and working alongside Black youth have shaped your understanding of Black outer space and Black youth resistance, love, futures, and identities. Dr. Coles, in particular right now, I'm thinking of you and the work that you do in conceptualizing Black liberatory educational spaces. May we please hear about how you see multimodality in particular as embedded in Blackness and Black literacies? How does such multimodality inform both the goal and process for breaching educational futures that exist beyond the confines of anti-Blackness?
Yeah, thank you for that. And hello, everyone. I'm just happy to be here with these brilliant panelists and for all of you all who have joined us today. Just directly connecting to Dr. Jones and Dr. Tolliver, I think, Frank Wilderson, right, he has this idea that if anti-Blackness somehow disappeared from this earth, right, then like to Dr. Tolliver's point, in a way, the world would cease to exist. Like we just really don't know how to function, and we can't function without anti-Blackness. And in that way, I think a big part of my work more recently that I've been getting into is thinking about struggles for Black justice and freedom as eco-justice, right? It's this idea of like, how do Black people, because we're always sort of saving things, even though people say that we aren't here to have meaning, how do we create worlds that actually save the world and create future worlds, knowing that our presence really, right, and sort of being subjected or subjugated is sort of this tactic, an ongoing strategy for human renewal. And again, where non-Black people are sort of made and remade to become better people, but sort of Black people are sort of pushed to the margins or the sidelines. So again, I wanted to start there thinking about what does it mean to not be able to imagine a future, particularly where we really just need anti-Blackness to be that future. So sort of the hard work that we have to do with that. And so the paper that I did, that I'll be talking about today was with a grad student, really this idea about Black English outer spaces. And it really gets at that point in particular. So we kind of start from this premise, like, what if there is no saving English education? And what if there is no saving the world? And so we ground this idea of outer space in Jared Sexton's line of thinking that says Black life is not lived in the world that the world lives in, but it is lived underground in outer space. And so thinking about the chokehold of like whiteness and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, we know that Black people still live sort of rich lives, particularly like rich lives grounded and informed by like literacy. And so we wanted to think about when we decenter anti-Blackness, even if temporary, right, even if fleeting, like how is Blackness being made and sort of remade? And so just to quickly answer the questions about Dr. Liu around like multimodality and sort of sharing some of the critical literacy artifacts, I think in the Afrofuturist sense, which some of my colleagues are sort of definitely already mentioned and sort of leaned into, when we think about the world that will have had to be created for our liberation, multimodality sort of really helps us construct what that world is in the now and what it may be in sort of future moments of our being and living, and is directly facilitating the process of getting there. So I think because anti-Blackness is not this like stagnant thing, or it's not one-dimensional, I think we must be about multimodality. And in many ways, I think Black living just inherently already is about multimodality, sort of about existing beyond the confines of anti-Blackness, or at least in tandem with anti-Blackness, again, in this outer space that might be different. And yeah, so I think I just really want us to think about, and what I've been thinking about is multimodality as a sort of technique of defense, right? And in many ways, aggression to the system of anti-Blackness. And so that directly connects to when I engaged my Black students in critical literacy artifacts, I position those as these sort of techniques of defense and aggression to sort of combat anti-Blackness. So very quickly, and hopefully this paper, we're able to share it with you all when it comes out. There is a student named Terrence, and he draws this image where it's an ocean, and then in the ocean, he puts the words equality and Blackness, and then he says racism is in the clouds. And so we get this very sort of embodied understanding of this underground space and sort of how really Blackness is inclusive, right? Like Black people, we ain't bothering nobody, right? We just live in our own life. But like, you know, in the clouds is all this shit, right? This like racism, this anti-Blackness. And of course, we do have to experience it because when we come up for air to breathe, right? But I think what I want us to think about and what in these critical literacy artifacts have taught me is that what is above our underground spaces, that's really just the overflow of what whiteness gets to see from us. Our real dynamic lives are in these underground outer spaces. And so what does that mean? There's another artifact I'll share quickly by a student named Lee. And we sort of wanted to think about what does it mean if sort of Black people weren't present. So she drew two planets, one if Black people were present and one if Black people were not. And in the one where Black people are present, it's, you know, it's fertile, it's abundant, it looks beautiful. And then in the one where Black people are not, it's sort of this decrepit, sort of empty space, which really helps us to counter this idea. Brittany Cooper, right, talks about how it was believed that Black people had no contributions to world making. And so in this critical literacy artifact, the student completely disrupts that by saying, in the Wilderson sense, like, hey, actually, if Black people were not here, there would not be no world. And so I think I'll stop there, and hopefully I'll be able to come back to some things later. But this idea that we have to wrestle with, and I think all of us on this panel are wrestling with, this Blackness sort of being this thing that is sort of disdained, but also this thing that is needed for us all to survive. And sort of what does that mean for the work that we do? So I'll stop there.
There's a lot there. Thank you. As you're thinking about what you were talking about, it makes me think about Dr. Griffin's and Dr. Turner's work too. And Dr. Griffin, I know you work with many Black youth who are thinking about ways that they use multimodality as resistance. And we would love to hear how that is working in those spaces. And if you see any parallels with that in terms of these Black liberatory spaces that Dr. Coles just talked about.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Dr. Liu for organizing this space. Definitely a lot of overflow with what Dr. Coles was talking about. And I see that Dr. Tolliver put in the notes that she loves this idea of the overground as overflow. And I see a lot of that in my own work. And also just this idea of how Black students are world making through their multimodal creations. Like Justin mentioned, our lives in large part are multimodal. There's this quote that's in the National Museum of African American History that says, God created Black folks and Black folks created style. And that comes through in everything that we do and how we practice literacy and how we communicate and how we talk with one another. And so in a lot of the work that I do with students, I have them create these visions of how they see the world around them, how they see themselves. In one of a chapter that I'm working on right now with Dr. Player, who I noticed is here, we're looking at how girls of color in particular are thinking about the world around them and how they're envisioning their futures. And so one of the things that Tamara Butler says in a piece is that she sees lots of green spaces, and we've seen lots of blue and green and orange and lots of outdoor spaces and how they're imagining their futures and this resistance to them being enclosed in classroom spaces. If you think about a classroom, a lot of times these classrooms are 4 walls, white walls, these chairs are in rows, and that's not how we communicate. That's not what our practices of communication and fellowship are. If I go to my auntie's house for dinner, we're not sitting in rows communicating and talking. There might be a kids table, right? And we might sit at the kids table, but there's no space where we're sitting in rows and having these conversations. And so to be able to have them create these multimodal spaces where they're engaging in ways that feel most natural to them, and in academia too. To be able to have these conversations that feel most natural to them is really powerful for them to own the space and create the spaces that they want to see in the future right now today. And I think what is even more interesting for me as I'm doing this work is thinking about the ways they're creating these spaces in the digital. Especially a lot of my work takes place in cities that are being gentrified, like actively gentrified, modern day colonialism happening where they live. And so the spaces where we commune, the barbershops, the beauty salons, the churches, the restaurants, some of them no longer exist because they've been taken over, right? And so what they're doing now is they are finding space where they can go online to create these fugitive spaces for them to commune together. Sometimes outside of whiteness for sure, and sometimes outside of the eyes of adults, because even as grown folks, sometimes we police the things that students are doing. And so they're able to go to TikTok, to Snapchat, to Instagram, to create websites, to have these spaces that are for us, by us, and they're not being disturbed by adults. I think I'm going to stop right there for right now. But yeah, that's a lot of what I'm seeing in the work.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Griffin. I'm excited to read about your work with Dr. Player, who I see is blowing up the chat right now and throughout the whole time. Hello. That brings me to inviting Dr. Turner. You and I have known each other for quite a long time. When I You are the first person that I think of when I think of multimodal counter narratives, when I think of multimodal work with Black young people. And I know you're doing some amazing work with photographs and photo voice. May we please hear about that?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Lou, for creating this space and this conversation. I'm just so filled up right now, just hearing all the wisdom and just brilliance of the folks on this panel. So thank you so much for this. I also want to just give a quick shout out to Shaniqua Castle, who is my research assistant on the project I'll be talking about. And she's a doctoral student in the urban education program that Dr. Lou runs. So it's just, she did so much work on this project with me. It was a quick project and one that we're getting now into publication. And so I just wanted to acknowledge her for all her hard work on this project. What I wanted to talk a little bit about are the photo stories that I had some Black young people create in terms of working and thinking about their COVID experiences. And so what Shaniqua and I actually did, this basically came from my own sense of being a mama of an undergraduate in this space where I have a freshman who went to college in California in fall 2019. He came home with us in February 2020, and he didn't return back to his campus in California until last month, actually, when their quarter began. And so seeing him frustrated, seeing the isolation, and just hearing me telling him at 2 a.m, get off your computer, go to bed. All of these frustrations made me think about what experiences other Black young people on college campuses might have been having. And so we had our participants work with us to create photo stories about their COVID experiences and curating photos from the time frame of March 2020, around that time when the crisis really hit forward until the spring semester. And so we had just a wonderful time working and learning alongside of these young people who were sharing just beautiful photographs and beautiful work with us. And so we found 6 key resources because we wanted to look at the barriers that they were facing during COVID, but also the resources and the supports that they found during that particular time frame. And so I think they connect to anti-Blackness because so I've been thinking about Patricia McKittrick's idea of plantation futures and thinking about how universities are serving as plantation spaces, particularly for Black undergraduate students and Black graduate students and Black faculty, to be honest. And what those futures then are promoting and reproducing is Black death, really. There is no real future. So we're counted for diversity purposes, for example, but not supported. And that was something that I really wanted to talk about with some of these students and to hear their experiences, particularly during COVID. So the 2 themes I just wanted to talk very briefly about today are, the first one is really around self-care, and the practices that they showed us through their photography were just absolutely beautiful. We saw pictures of them walking in the woods. We saw pictures of them on the beach by themselves. We saw pictures of them walking sometimes with parents and with brothers and sisters at times. And Autumn's always really good about reminding me of the power of rest. And so many of the students said, this was my first time I got a chance to actually rest, because these were high achievers. So part of the counter narrative that Dr. Lou was talking about is that there's this sense that Black high achievers don't exist. When we see the statistics in university spaces, they often talk about the failures of Black students or the unpreparedness for college that they might have or bring with them. And so there's not a lot of research out there. And the people that I can think of are some of the folks from Maryland. So Sharon Fries-Britt, Kimberly Griffin, others that are doing this kind of work on Black high achievers. And so that's where we were kind of centered in this work. And so to hear them say that, I was doing online internships, I was doing all my classes online, I was still involved in all my social organizations, but I had a chance to rest and actually think about my own wellness, my own humanity, and to be able to take a pause in terms of exercising and reinventing who I wanted to be, I think was so important. And so the beautiful photographs, we just were so inspired by the self-care practices that these young people were engaged in, from crocheting to painting to creating collaborative Spotify playlists to all kinds of word vision boards they were creating, all kinds of practices that they were engaging to take care of themselves, to preserve themselves, to keep themselves going. And we were just so just amazed at the possibilities that they had in terms of self-care. And so as we were analyzing, we were thinking of Audre Lorde's wise words: caring for myself is not a self-indulgence. It is a self-preservation. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of warfare. And so for that definition, that self-determination that these young people had in talking against those futures that would keep telling them to keep producing and keep going without listening to their bodies, without listening to their hearts, without listening to their spirits, and taking the time to fill themselves up. Because these students were dealing with the traumas that we all were dealing with. Some of them had family members that were sick. Some of them, we're going through really difficult circumstances. And so this self-care practice was really important. And then the other piece of this was just this idea of the activism that these young people undertook at the same time. And so I was one of the people that thought about this idea that there are twin pandemics, and it's racism and the health pandemic. And then I started reading, and I don't know who it was, but it was Bridget Turner Kelly who actually said they're not twin pandemics. Racism is its own pandemic. It is not the same as a global pandemic for which there is a vaccination and a movement forward. If we don't think about white supremacy and the implications that has, and disrupt and dismantle, break that system down, it's not going to go anywhere, whereas COVID could very well move on. And so that has made me pause again and think about these young people, and just the beautiful photographs again of them marching with Black Lives Matter, marching with the NSARS movement, doing the digital work that Autumn was just talking about. They were some serious digital activists. So they would show us screenshots of them going back and forth with people talking about all lives matter. They were on it. They showed us going back and forth, like let me tell you. One young woman created a whole course around racial inequality and showed us the website, the resources, and all the beautiful readings and videos that she had curated for the purposes of helping to educate. And so these Black young people were doing some work, and they were doing it in the frustration of knowing that not everyone believed them or felt the same way. And so one of them said, my white friends, they just didn't understand the struggles of races. For me, it was like, oh, my friends they ain't as woke as I thought they were, because they don't understand wearing a mask, doing something that simple to help us. So again, they were doing it within all this frustration, but the activism, the resistance, that love that they had for their community and for themselves was just so important. And that to me speaks directly against the plantation futures that they are living and experiencing right here, right now. And I'll stop there as well.
Thank you so much for bringing that idea of self-care up. I know that so much of this work requires a deep emotional and personal investment. It is incredibly laborious, but also deleterious and to your health and well-being. So I appreciate that opening for us I'd just like to invite the rest of the panelists to share how do you do this work in ways that you sustain yourself? What are some of the things that you're learning from how as Dr. Turner has just shared, that the youth are modeling? What are you doing for yourself? And then how do you also remodel that with the youth participants that you learned from?
I can start here. So one of the things that I'm learning from a lot of the youth that I'm working with is that they are unapologetically bold and audacious in saying what they need. And I have loved watching them do that. I've loved the way that it's caused me to reflect on who I am and how I show up, and the ways that I can be encouraged to go into a space and say, no, this is what I need in this moment, in ways that are just so fruitful and so fulfilling. I think to your question of like the ways that we find rest in this work, I've been thinking about this a bit since you sent us over some of the questions. And one of the things that came to mind was finding spaces of celebration and of joy and of love. I think that for me, growing up, I used to love to like go out to parties in high school and my parents could not stand it. Like, you don't have to go to a party every weekend, right? I also really loved, in particular, praise and worship at church on Sunday mornings, right? Where I could cry, where I could sing, I could dance, I could fall on the ground if I needed to, right? I could have a space to be momentarily free. And so for me, it's finding those spaces where anti-Blackness is shielded in some sense, right? I am with my folks. I'm free. I'm going to be loved on. I'm free to be who I am, to move how I want to move in this space, to emote the ways I want to emote. And so for me, it's finding those spaces and also learning from the youth that I'm working with.
Thank you.
I can jump in very quickly. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Jones, I saw you. Oh, okay, very quickly, just to this point, I think in connecting to what I was saying earlier and to what Autumn was just saying, I think for me, understanding that this fight to against anti-Blackness, I've been positioning more as like a secondary sort of thing in sort of life and sort of the world. And again, going back to this idea of like Black life already being this dynamically rich thing, hence why it is sought out to be policed, jailed, punished, all these things, because it is this already free thing that exists and people know that. And sort of they want to make us feel that we are not these things. And so turning inwards to Blackness, and I think many of us on this panel have been doing that with our work, and thinking about critical race English education. Lamar talks about like loving Blackness to death. And, you know, Maya Angelou says this idea that love is the part of the human condition so profound that it allows me to survive. And so I think turning into Blackness, Black love is what gets us to survive and to build these really robust underground spaces. And it's kind of like, you know what, when I have time, you know, I'll come up to get air and like fight anti-Blackness and to sort of let these people believe that sort of I somehow don't have this life outside of this, right? But that's not the case. So I think that has allowed me to sustain myself, to know that I have this life well beyond what white supremacy, white settler colonialism, all these things can sort of seek to box me in. So.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to add something to that. I think just going off what both of these wonderful people have just said about care and rest, I would like to attribute it to when you have your own business, you can be unbothered, right? And I feel like part of my self-care ritual is having my own business. You get what I mean by that? And so sometimes I think that like the shackles of what we've been talking about in terms of white supremacy, in terms of how anti-Blackness is repetitive and shows up in our lives, is that what Toni Morrison told us, it's a distraction, right? They want to keep us occupied and they wanted to keep us off task when we really know what it's like to have joy and fullness in our lives. And which means to me that I have my own business, right? Y'all can see in the hotel background in this room, it's just like, well, I'm about to live a little bit. I can still do the work that we have together, but we're also going to travel and we're also going to rest and we're going to sleep diagonally in this bed because that's my business, right? That's Tabitha Brown saying that to everybody. This is my business. And so I think about what Dr. Turner is saying about students went through the pandemic too. Children went through the pandemic too, and they're suffering from this as well. But one thing that I recognize when I'm mapping all of these incidents of racial trauma in schools, it didn't take a rest off when school went virtual. They were just trying to police Black children in their homes. And what ended up happening is that Black families said, guess what? My children are getting more relief being here at home than in the school that we used to send them to every day, right? So we're getting a break from this racial trauma. And now we're trying to push kids back into school systems that never loved them. And so some parents are trying to make a decision about whether or not I'm going to do this with my baby right now, whether or not this is even worth it, because we're giving something up. That curriculum violence project is teaching me that we're constantly giving something up to be a part of this system. But how we rebuke it and how we resist it is that we have our own business and we stay in our own joy. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Yes. I'm just going to say yes after everybody. I love what you're saying about like minding your own, right? Like I think about my mama often said that to me when I was younger, and it had a different meaning, but I think that it applies a lot to like what you're talking about here, what all of us are talking about. And I think one of the things that I'm learning from youth that I think I had semblances of when I was younger, but it wasn't as fully formed, is that they build off of the people that came before in ways that are just brilliant, right? Like, I think that sometimes, and I think that's part of the anti-Black colonialist project, is to forget about the things that came before you, as if this is something only you have dealt with. And so like, I'm hearing from kids who've been reading James Baldwin, and when I didn't get access to Baldwin until I was in college, I'm hearing students talking about, have you watched Sankofa? I'm like, y'all watch that? Like, and like the fact that like there are things that are building off of the past in ways that I don't think I got when I was growing up. Like, yes, we talked about the past, but never how to build off of it, how we're thinking about our futurities on top of the things that our ancestors built up for us. And so I think that was something that I learned. And then I also appreciate what Justin was saying about just like, this part of my life is the work, but like we have full humanity. And I think that's a part of anti-Blackness, is to take away that full humanity and say, your job is to fix us. And I'm like, no, that's on y'all. I'll come in, I will help, I will talk to people. I'm so good at really lovingly critiquing the things that are happening, but that's like 4% of my life. The other 96 is stuff that I enjoy. That's reading about futures and fantasies. That's going outside to play with my son and beating him in basketball. It's going back home, talking to my mama and my aunties, where I learn about all the petty stuff that they did when they was younger. Like, there's so much more to my life than just this part of the work. And I think that's, yes, the overflow, Justin. Like, y'all see some of it. Y'all don't see all of it. Y'all get what I give you. And that is part of my self-care.
Wow. Thank you very much for your responses. As you're talking about this, Dr. Tolliver, it's making me think about the roles of non-Black educators, right? What do you see as the role, if at all, any, of non-Black educators in the work to rupture anti-Blackness?
I mean, I'll just say, like, it is their work. Like, I feel like like what their role is that's their work. Like, they need to do that work. And it's gonna be hard. It's going to create tension, because like, you're going to have to upend so much of what you've been taught to know from society, from your parents, from history. Like, there's a lot there, but it's like, there's so much that you can learn from, like, the scholars in this room. You could read all of their work and learn a lot about how you can go about doing it, but you're going to have to do that work. You can't rely on someone else to do it for you. You can't rely on, be like, hey, how can I disrupt anti-Blackness? Like, you have to think about who you are, what you know, where you come from, and how that is all parts of projects of anti-Blackness, and then disrupt that in yourself first, and then also figure out ways to disrupt it in the world. But you got to do it in yourself first before you try to go out and fix things.
I can jump into that, Dr. Tolliver, picking up earlier, there was some jokes, but very real ideas about like these lists, right? You know, I'm like, if you want a list like that, that's where you can come in, right? Like you create these structures and these things and these formulas that, you know, may help other sort of white folks and sort of, you know, like learn through these things. But I don't think that's the labor for us. And, you know, I think instead of me perhaps speaking quickly on like what they can do, I think maybe I want to talk a bit about why. And I think if we think about like Blackness, right, as sort of constructed as like dead and deathly, or like on the precipice of death, I think that then we also have to think that then the world, right, in the Farrerian sense of like we're all being dehumanized, is also like this dead matter sort of floating in space. And so everyone on this planet is deathly by proximity to sort of how we sort of police Blackness and like make Blackness this thing that is already dead and not worth living. And so I think when we look around the world and sort of like how things are, and going back to this idea of like geography and geology, and sort of even now as people are talking about sort of climate change and crisis, like, you know, I think the world is already in that space because of how we have treated Black and Indigenous folks. And so if white folks see any interest in really uncovering sort of the boundless nature of humanity and really what humanity could truly be, they need to see that they are also dead and always dying, similar to how they project sort of Black folks to be.
And teachers, just kind of jumping on that, just need to give Black students some space. Like, I heard so many of these young Black people that we were working with just saying things like, my professor never even talked about this. We're on virtual on Zoom and they've never even mentioned the pandemic or how we're doing or what we're feeling. We haven't even talked about that. And it's listening. And it was making me think of how you gaze upon people, and there is a Black gaze. And I don't know if teachers can take on that gaze, but they can certainly listen to it. They can certainly learn for it, be humble, and learn to look through different eyes at other people and not just say, but this is my content. This is where I need to go today on this lesson. So, you know, this is where we're going. It's that space that so many Black students aren't getting a chance. And even in the pandemic, but well before that, weren't getting a space to talk about who they are and to bring their full selves and their full humanity into the classroom. And if they didn't see it represented within the curriculum, then they weren't going to feel that affirmation. So many people in K-12 and even beyond, Black folks are still, Black kids especially, still feeling so much like my teacher doesn't understand me. Like, school is, why am I here? Why am I doing this? And some of them were raising those questions, like, why am I here in an institution that I don't feel like I even belong in? Why am I then working so hard? So I think teachers do have an obligation. They have a responsibility not to do harm. And it's by listening to students, just giving some space, even that is more humanizing than just moving through a curriculum that's already set up and you're trying to teach through because you feel like that's your lesson. No, you're teaching young people. You're not teaching content, you're teaching young people. And there's a difference.
I think the common thread that I heard as everyone was speaking was this idea of listening. And what keeps coming to mind is Kendrick Lamar's line about sit down, be humble. And I feel like that's really what needs to happen, right? Is that white teachers have to, and non-Black teachers have to be willing to sit and to listen. And then when you listen, to humble yourself. You might hear some things that you don't like, and it's not for you to clap back at students. It's for you to listen to what they're saying, to not police their words, to reflect on yourself, right? Yolanda Seeley-Ruiz's work on archaeology of the self, that is the work that every teacher needs to take up, because it starts with you. It starts with how are your experiences, your biases shaping how you're approaching this work? And like Dr. Turner said, you're not teaching curriculum, you're teaching students, you're working with humans. People send their very best to school to be under your care. And so as a result, we have a responsibility then as educators to think about what that means, that we are getting someone's very best, the best that they have, they're sending to us. And we have a responsibility to love on them. And so I think that for non-Black and white teachers in particular, it's about sitting down, being humble, and listening to what students are saying.
A lot of what I'm hearing too is depending on teachers being good and doing the right thing. I don't know if that is always something that we can think about. And I'm a pessimistic person, so I'm just going to say that. So what would motivate teachers to do the right thing? I think a lot about intentionalities. I think about good intentions and how that is a fallacy that we teach, that we're asking teachers to have good intentions, and that could also lead to harm as well. So what are some of your thinking around that? Because I hear what you're saying. I hear it, and I want to talk to pre-service teachers to say, this is how we do it. You've got to listen. You can say all those things, but I don't know that depending on good intentionalities will necessarily always disrupt that racism because it's so deeply structured. I see my dear friend Dr. Jones, doing this. So you tell me what you're thinking right now.
Well, yeah, I got energy for this statement because I hear this a lot, especially when people are doing harm to children. It's the first thing that they use as a rationale to help them escape accountability is that my intention, blah, blah, blah. I stop listening after they start that. So here's the example that I gave to a lecture at Iowa State that I did a couple of days ago. If I go out here and I get in my car and I'm out here reckless and I rear end somebody, if I get out of the car and say, you know what, that was my bad. My intention was, I didn't mean to get that close to your bumper. So have a good day. And I get in my car and I drive away. That's not how it works. Somebody's insurance company is going to get in touch with me. They're going to come to my house. They're going to do whatever they need to do. And they're going to say, excuse me, Dr. Jones, you have to repair the harm that you did. Regardless of your intention or whether or not you meant to hit this person, their car was damaged by something that you did. And you have to repair that. So if everything was just based on intentions, y'all, we wouldn't even need insurance. Okay. So when we're talking about intentions, at this point in the game, it's sabotage because you know better. Right. And so while we're waiting on your feelings to get right, people are being harmed. Children are being harmed. Like Dr. Griffin said, the best of us, the best of our children are coming into this classroom ready to learn and they're being harmed. And then you want to feel upset about it. We can't wait. We can't wait. James Baldwin continuously asked us, how much more of my time do you want? How much more of my family's time do you want? Based on this idea of intentions, we have to interrupt that pattern as it's being spoken because all it's doing is continuing this legacy of we do not want to interrupt this disposable, this otherness that you have a situated Blackness in. We're not having it. Bump the intentions.
Does anybody else have thoughts to add to that?
I mean, I just want to say, like, hopefully to this point directly from Dr. Jones is like, I guess really just like not letting people slide, like not letting teachers slide. I think there's a way in which, particularly in our current moment, really any moment, where we sort of allow like teachers of Black students, particularly white teachers, to sort of still put forth this idea that they aren't aware, that they are sort of ignorant. And there's a way in which aloofness becomes like okay, particularly in like teacher education spaces. Even as a teacher educator, there is this almost like generational thing that happens where like every white teacher who I've ever taught says like, oh, well, I grew up not talking about race, or I don't know anything about race. And like, it has to stop. But I think we accept that, like that can't happen, right? Like, and so like we need to sort of shut down that idea that that's okay. Like you can you can be in the world and communicate to people. Like that's very violent. Like you telling me that you don't have to do that. And I think that directly just goes to Dr. Jones's ideas of intentions, right? Like there's no room for that anymore. Like you need to get it together, and there is no other exit, right? The exit is that you confront this, and I think that's how we make progress. But as I'm saying this, I'm reflecting on my own teaching in this semester. Like, what might that mean to sort of let that slide? And I just don't think we have the time for that anymore. So,
yeah. Thank you so much for all of your ideas and brilliances. I think that what I'm also hearing though is that teachers do have to get it together, but there's also the privilege that they must give up of what they understand as the status quo. And doing that is going to be something that I don't know can happen. And I think a lot about ways that Black children continue to be harmed because the structure is that way, but also that people privilege from it. So that there's a lot that you've all brought up, and the urgency, I feel it, and I hope that our audience feels it, that the addressing of centering Black youth living is important. I would like to thank all of you for your incredible work that you're doing to affirm Blackness in our schools and classrooms. Thank you for your ongoing work to dismantling anti-Black racism in our curriculum, practice, and culture. And importantly, thank you for your commitment to honoring the full humanity and lives of Black youth. You are all the most excellent. And thank you for sharing this afternoon with us.